그럼 저희 본격적으로
And now the session will begin. Good morning. This is the 17th World Oceans Forum Marine Finance Session. My name is Park Se-won and I'm your MC. This Marine Finance session will discuss the topic of challenge for the future maritime finance. We will be sharing cases of advanced financial systems and discuss the future and direction of shipping finance. This session will be moderated by Mr. Song Nak-ju, former Director of Maritime Finance Division of Korea Ocean Business Corporation. Please welcome him with a big hand.
안녕하세요.
Good morning. As introduced, I am the former Director of Maritime Finance Division of the KOBC. My name is Song Nak-ju. Thank you very much for taking the time out of busy schedules to join us in person and online. It is an honor to moderate this session. In fact, until last year, we did not have a marine finance session up until last year, but it's the first time we are launching the marine finance session as an independent session. As you know, shipping requires a massive investment. It is capital intensive and involves large facilities. To bring online one LNG carrier, it takes about $170 million to $260 million. So this cannot be financed by a single entity. Most of the financing has to be leveraged from external lenders. And out of shipping cost, the finance cost takes up a large time, and therefore ship financing takes up a large proportion of shipping. At the very first marine finance session, we will be discussing the challenge for the future maritime finance, and we will have 3 presentations and 3 panels. We have a lot of topics that we are facing in maritime finance: ESG, decarbonization, eco-friendly ships, lease, SIC, bond-based shipping, and many other alternative fuels available for shipping. But today we will be discussing the challenge for the future maritime finance in order to expand the base of ship financing. We have 3 presentations. Let me introduce the first presenter.
첫 번째 발표자는 멀리
Our first presenter flew from Singapore to give this particular presentation, Mr. Gerbrant Vroegop. In 1999, he joined ENG, and in Rotterdam, London, and Singapore. Starting from 2020, he settled in Singapore and serving as a managing director, and he is the head of transport and logistics APAC. The theme of his presentation is in line with the theme of maritime finance. His theme is the challenges for ship finance. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Good morning. Just this one. It's a great pleasure to be here in Busan, to be back, and to see all of you here today. I'm also very thankful for the invitation for ING to be part of this event, and I think there is a very interesting program, and I'm delighted to start with my presentation, which is about the topic, the challenges for ship finance. In the next 15 minutes, I will take you through the following subjects, to start with the availability of bank finance. We will then talk a bit more about the cost of bank finance, what determines the cost, and what are then actually the challenges when you look at the availability and the cost for both the bank as well as the borrowers. after which we go into the future of the challenges for ship finance, and to conclude with what you and us can do to face these challenges. Availability of bank debt. Maybe before we start going into this slide, based on my experience, bank debt is by far the most efficient and cheap form of funding of shipping assets. And yes, there are other funding instruments. You can think about bonds or other structures like private equity, but bank debt by far the most efficient and cheap form of funding. Now, I've taken the perspective as bank debt. There is a much wider perspective possible when you talk about ship finance or maritime finance, but that was the decision to take. Now, if you look at it from a bank perspective, there are three pillars which determine the availability of bank debt. The first one, credit requirements. The second one, commercial criteria. And the third, ESG ambitions. Now, if you look at the credit requirements, it's about the financial strengths and the financial performance of a ship operator or a ship owner. We also take into account the loan structure, the security we have, combined with the outlook for a specific market, and the management and, for example, the strategy. Now, banks have credit processes, and I think what you see on the availability is that over the past 2 decades, we've learned a lot going up to 2008, seeing a lot of liquidity going in the market and a lot of banks providing ship finance. After 2008, that very much dried up. Then again, 2016-17, when the liner industry faced tremendous challenges, the availability bank debt came down again. And then with COVID and the pandemic and thereafter, we saw again that financial strength was there and the performance and bank debt availability moved back. The next one we as bank look at is commercial criteria. And I have to say in the last 5 to 10 years, what we see is that commercial criteria, in particular return, has become so much more important. And we look not just at what do we make on a lending transaction, but much more what do we add as value to a client and the overall return on the long-term relationship. And what you see is that banks have integrated that commercial decision process in their overall processes. So before banks go for a credit committee, there will be always a conversation about what's the commercial rationale for this. The third one, and probably the newest one and the most interesting one I think for today's topic, is ESG ambitions. Decarbonization, a topic we read about and hear about every day. We look at the borrowers, the operators, policies, track records, and the roadmap to decarbonize, but also the bigger picture, ESG. Next to that, it's also about the investments, be it in new technology vessels with dual fuel technology, making use of retrofits to improve the efficiency. What I don't talk about here today is about the financial markets. And we can also see that the availability of bank debt is very much a function of the financial markets and the availability of liquidity. We've seen in recent times again a squeeze of that liquidity. That may change again, but for this presentation we leave that aside. Each of these three, credit profile, commercial criteria and ESG ambitions, also are main factors in determining the pricing of debt. Cost and challenges. If we talk about the cost, everyone has experienced the sharp increase in interest rates, be it SOFR for the US dollars or be it Euribor for euros. We all have to face a higher interest rate, which has driven up the cost of debt for ship operators. Another part where we see increased cost is that due to regulatory requirements, there are a lot more processes to be run by banks, and the cost of these processes weighs down together with inflationary pressures, which increased higher cost of employment and such of providing bank debt. The third part is regulatory, and it's about capital which we have to set aside as a bank for a reserve for volatility in the markets. Basel III, Basel IV, in response of the global financial crisis, have and will further increase the capital requirements for shipping, and this will drive up the cost. Then lastly, we talk about funding cost itself. Banks have faced higher funding cost again in recent times, a reflection of the financial markets, and next to that also a reflection of the higher risk environment generally. If you put that together, the availability and the cost, then you can see 5 challenges we face. I think the first one is limited supply of bank debt as a reflection of the losses lenders have faced in ship finance. And what I do want to say is that there is sufficient liquidity available, but it goes to a certain group in the market, and these are typical the larger operators. I think the second point is that we see increased capital requirements, like mentioned earlier, due to regulations, and that is a real challenge because it will drive up the cost for a bank, and as a result, that will most likely be passed on to the borrowers. Then we have the high interest rate environment that may be here for quite some time, and this is something which most people have not been used to over the past 5 to 10 years when money was really available at low cost. Then there is the discussion of scaling and standardization. Under pressure of central banks and just general for banks to lower their cost base, scale is very important. And what it means is that the smaller and medium-sized ship operators face one big challenge, and that is that finance may not be available to them at the cost larger companies can attract it. So you see a split in the market with the larger corporate shipping companies having sufficient liquidity at very competitive cost because it can be scaled by banks, while the smaller and medium-sized operators will face a challenge and have to go to higher cost providers. And the last one, reputational risks. This is one which I will talk in the next slide about and is another very important part to look at. What I do see is that these challenges are there and different sources of funding will from time to time come in to fill the gaps when there is a misalignment in risk and return where bank debt cannot provide the liquidity. Talking about reputational risks, this is really about banks having a non-negotiable position. And we can see it with ESG, where many banks have chosen not to any longer finance coal mining, for example. But we also see it with sanctions, where increased geopolitical risks have meant that banks are very careful and document very precisely when they can get out of loan commitments if sanctions are breached or potentially breached. Tax risk, we see a global tax regime being implemented and offshore jurisdictions are less and less favored. And lastly, financial crime, a big challenge for banks to make sure that the money part of the system is clean and we don't get investigated. Reputation risk can really close a business, and I think we very well have to be aware as shipping that we need to improve our image, and we as bank also play our role in this. The biggest challenge for us now is the decarbonization of shipping. And maybe to start with the most practical element, and that is simply about data collection and analysis. Now, ING Bank is part of the Poseidon Principles, which was founded in 2019, and we are a signature of it, which means very simple that we measure the carbon footprint of our ship lending portfolio and compare that to the pathways set for the ships we finance and the climate alignment goals we have. If I look at that process, it takes typically 4 to 6 months to collect and analyze the data on the previous calendar year. That can be a lot more efficient, and we need the help from the operators and from generally the ecosystem to get that done quicker. Then, as mentioned earlier by Mr. Xiong, there is the CAPEX requirements. If you look at the numbers which are required, and we can just make estimates, it's going to be humongous. We face there technology risks and residual value risks, and we have to look at risk allocation, who is taking which risks. The next one is the funding gap. If indeed these CAPEX estimates are correct, then bank debt will not be sufficient and we will face scarcity. There is also the price risk and return challenges. In the end, all of us need to run a commercial business and we all need to make sure that we can stay relevant. So we can't simply invest and finance technologies which don't have a long-term future. And then thirdly, the challenge of managing the transition process. I already mentioned coal mining and that many financial institutions choose not to be associated with that. We have to be very careful that for shipping, we manage this process and don't take decisions to exit crude tankers or other transport of fossil fuels, because ultimately for energy security and energy affordability, we do need the transportation. It needs to be a gradual process, and we as ING are committed to that. I think also one of the challenges here is incomplete and imperfect information. We get a lot of information about future fuels, but no one really knows yet which fuel is going to be favored, is going to be preferred, by when and at what cost. And it's very important to, at this stage, just share information and make sure we're all at the same page. Future landscape. 3 parts to it. Maybe first about the providers. What I see is that many banks have left over the years ship finance. And that was because of the losses they have made. The big risk is here that you have a knowledge and experience drain, and we're again at risk of making the same mistakes as we have made in the past. So what I think is very, very important is to use the experience, to use the knowledge, and make sure that that sector expertise is being used to provide finance and go through this transition. As mentioned earlier, you will see other finance sources appear. Each has a role, each has a cost, and I think it's very important that we're open to that, because there is no one-fit solution, and I think we need a dynamic market to all be successful. The second part on structures, export finance, like K-SURE and Kexim here in Korea, are critical to the success because of the risks, as explained earlier, and the cost, which includes also regulatory costs like Basel IV, where export finance structures are actually being seen preferred by banks. The support of these export credit agencies will make the difference in being sufficient debt made available, and also at the price which is competitive, which allows for new technologies to be used. What you also see is that loan structures will evolve, and they will reflect new regulations coming out that can be on sanctions, that can be on climate goals, can be on ship recycling, that will be reflected in documentation, but also more generally on credit risk, where structures will adjust over time. Then lastly, for the future, availability and cost. I think on the cost side, we took out here the example of higher interest rate cost for a longer period. That's one part. As mentioned, for various reasons, we have to look at higher cost of ship funding for a long period to come. I think the other part is the big gap in funding, and that is one which might, combined with the cost bill, be the real challenge, as mentioned earlier, in our strive for decarbonization. The conclusion of my presentation is, firstly, availability and cost are the 2 basics which determine which challenges we have, and it's dynamic. It will constantly move over time. Being a very optimistic person, I see it really as an opportunity, and I think there is a lot for us to do and to gain in this process. And my advice for everyone here is actually the first thing you have to do is simply look around and see what different funding sources are available and how can these be used for the different funding of ships or technologies and equipment. The second part is talk to the financial markets and understand what credit, commercial and sustainability criteria are being considered. This will really help you to get the right financing at the right cost in time. Last point, we all have to factor in higher cost, unfortunately, and potential scarcity, so just be prepared for that. That was the end of my presentation. In the slide deck there is also a slide on ING, but as we only have 15 minutes, I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
예, 오랜 경륜과 전문성에서 나온 발전.
That presentation came from his long years experience, so major factors around costs and challenges for ship finance and future landscape. Well, these were the main points picked up by Mr. Vroegop. Thank you very much for your presentation. Please thank him with a big round of applause.